Good morning. I am so happy to be here. It is really an honor to be in this sacred place. I first set foot in this building in 1978. I was a seminary student at Unity Village, and this was considered the Vatican of Unity, and this sanctuary was the Sistine Chapel. I was in awe of this, and I still have that feeling every time I come here, that it is a very sacred place. This has been often called the Founders Church, or the Mother's Church, or the flagship of the Unity movement, and it is an honor to be able to share with you this morning. After I was ordained, I was asked to be on a committee called the Admissions Committee, which reviewed applications from students that aspired to enter the seminary. And one of the applications I came across was one from a person that called themselves Duke. Duke Tufty. And when I saw that, I said, that can't be his real name. There's just no way. It's got to be an alias. So I called some of my colleagues and I asked them, what do you know about this Duke person? They said, not very much. I know he used to sell cars, but other than that, I don't know a whole lot. And I said, well, that, a used car salesman named Duke that wants to be a Unity minister. I don't know. But anyway. And it turns out, of course, that Reverend Duke Tufty has been one of the great leaders in the Unity movement. He's been the minister here for not only, 2 decades you've been here? 25 years, wow. And, yeah, that's something? Yeah. And he was also the chairman of the board of Unity School of Christianity for about 10 years. So thank you, Duke, for the opportunity to be here. But I'm here to talk to you about something I'm calling the evolutionary impulse. This evolutionary impulse is something that's occurring within you right now, whether you know it or not. So what I'd like you to do, if you're willing, is to feel your heartbeat, either touching your heart, your chest, or at your throat. Just see if you can get in touch with that heartbeat. And as you feel that, I want to ask you a question. That question is, when did that heartbeat begin? Most of us would say, 40, 50, 60 years ago. And I would suggest to you that perhaps that heartbeat began a long time ago, like about 14 billion years ago, with what scientists call the Big Bang. That energy of the Big Bang, which scientists cannot explain, is the same energy that causes your heart to beat. Scientists do not know what caused the Big Bang, and scientists do not know what causes your heart to beat. They can tell you how it beats, but they can't tell you what the source of that life is, you see. And I am advocating that this is the same energy, and that same intelligence and that same power and that same life that was behind what's called the Big Bang is behind every beat of your heart. So every time your heart beats, the Big Bang is recreated. And your body is a miniature universe. Your body is quite literally made of stardust. Every atom in your body was born in the heart of a star billions of years ago. And your body will return to stardust because you belong to the universe. And that universe is not something simply out there. That universe is also within you, with every beat of your heart, with every breath that you take. Cosmologist Brian Swimme great writer. He says, "What do you get if you have hydrogen gas and you leave it alone for 14 billion years? What do you get? You get rose bushes, giraffes, human beings." And he says this is perhaps the most important spiritual discovery of all time, that hydrogen gas turns into rose bushes and giraffes and human beings. So my question is, what is it? What is that intelligence? What is that power that changes hydrogen gas into Shakespeare and Mozart and Einstein and you and me? I'm calling that the evolutionary impulse. This evolutionary impulse has given birth to the universe, and it hasn't gone away, nor will it go away ever. About 3.5 billion years ago, when the universe was a little bit older, about an adolescent, it gave birth to this earth, and 1 billion years later to life on this earth. Life on this earth began about 3.5 billion years ago, and this was the beginning of biological evolution. About 200,000 years ago, something quite momentous happened. A gradual but very powerful shift occurred. For the first time since life on Earth began 3.5 billion years ago, the leading edge of evolution was no longer biological, but the evolution of consciousness. If we look back at the human body 100,000 years ago, it does not look that much different than it does today. Basically the same anatomy. However, our lifestyle has changed a little bit in the last 100,000 years, I would say. Look at what we've created in 100,000 years, and why is it that that's happened? It's not because of our biology, but because of the powerful intelligence that is emerging within us, because of the evolution of consciousness. And that evolution of consciousness is continuing to grow, and it's taking another quantum leap. Today we find ourselves at a crucial juncture in that evolution of consciousness. That today we must become conscious of our own evolution, because if we don't, we may not survive. We find that the consciousness that evolved, that has brought us this far in our civilization and in our world, is not going to take us into the next step of our evolution. Ironically, what took us this far, we need to temporarily let go of it. We have become identified with the mind, and in that identification with the mind, we have acquired powers that have been undreamed of by our ancestors. We have created a world that 100 years ago would be science fiction, that would be magic, that no one could even imagine. We have developed incredible knowledge, but our wisdom and our compassion is lagging far behind our knowledge. We have acquired great knowledge, but not the wisdom to use that knowledge. We have acquired great power, but not the wisdom to broker that power. So we are like a child with a gun in his hand, potentially very dangerous. Today, the greatest threat to human existence is human existence. Yes. Yeah. Remember the story, the character Pogo? Some of us do, that have been around a little while. Pogo was a little cartoon character. He was also a great philosopher. And he's noted for the quote that says, "We have met the enemy. We have met the enemy, and they is us." And indeed, we are our own greatest enemies. And yet at the same time, we are our own greatest saviors. The mind that created this is the mind that can go beyond it if we are willing to let go and enter into this evolutionary impulse, which is taking us to the next step. When a British newspaper posed the question, what's wrong with the world today? This was about 50 years ago. The noted writer G.K. Chesterton wrote this letter in response to the newspaper. He says, dear sirs, I am. Sincerely yours, G.K. Chesterton. Okay? You know? Now, how many of us can be that honest? You know, because we want to say, what's wrong with the world today? They are. Those people. Can we say, I am? And it's not us alone, of course, but it is the fact that we are clinging to something that's not working anymore. Our development has become dangerously one-sided. We have achieved an astounding degree of knowledge of the material world, and we remain appallingly ignorant of ourselves. And that never ceases to amaze me how technology and how science has advanced to mind-boggling stages. And at the same time, it never ceases to amaze me how ignorant we are of our own internal being. It's time to remedy that because we have overdeveloped knowledge, underdeveloped wisdom. The world that we've created is lopsided. The poorest half of the people on this planet own less than 1% of the wealth of this planet. 1%, the richest 1% of the people on this planet, own 40% of the wealth. We have developed a terribly out of balance world, and we cannot sustain this world. Something has to change. And many writers and many teachers and many spiritual leaders have been saying that in order to survive, we must wake up. You've heard that message before, I'm sure. So, what's keeping us asleep? How do we wake up? We find out what's keeping us asleep. So let's take a look at that. What's keeping us asleep is that we have become identified with this wonderful human mind, this wonderful intelligence that has gotten us this far. And that's the great paradox, is that we learn as human beings how to survive. We've learned the mind has created the survival mechanism that has made us the most powerful species on this planet. And it's the mind that we've become identified with. Most of us are not so much identified with our bodies as we are with our minds. I am my mind, many would say. Many years ago, René Descartes said, I think, therefore I am, you see. And we think we are our minds. That's what we identify with. So we're afraid to let that go. Because if we do, what's beyond that, you see? Evolution, though, is calling us to a greater reality. It's calling us beyond the mind. So we're caught in this dilemma of having the only thing that we know that has gotten us this far, that has helped us to survive, and the need in some way to let that go. Not to let go of the mind itself, but to let go of our identification with the mind. Because it's at the point where it's limiting our growth. It's like a pair of shoes that serves us so well as a child, yet as we grow older, they don't fit anymore. And those same shoes are problematic, you see. In the 1960s, there was a beautiful white Siberian tiger that was given to the U.S., to the National Zoo in Washington, D.C. This tiger was named Mohini. She was a beautiful Siberian tiger. And in those days, they put animals in cages. And so Mohini was put into a cage. And being a vibrant, wild animal, she had a lot of energy. And so Mohini expended her energy by pacing back and forth in kind of a figure eight inside of her cage, almost 24 hours a day. She would stop to eat and sleep briefly, but the rest of the time She simply paced back and forth in this figure 8. So a few years later, about a decade later, the zoo developed a new concept for keeping the animals, as the zoos do now. They have more of its natural habitat that they create. And so they created this great big space for Mohini. It was many, many acres, and it had a lake, a little pond. It had trees, it had rocks, it had a cave, it had everything to look like home for Mohini. And above all, it had great space, a great deal of space for her. So the zookeepers were very excited about releasing Mohini into this space so that she could enjoy her newfound freedom, her new environment. So when they released Mohini, what she did immediately was run to the furthest corner of the compound and begin to pace back and forth in the same figure 8, 10 by 10, back and forth. And sadly to say, she paced back and forth in that figure 8 for the rest of her life. She never left that corner of the compound. She never saw this new world that was available to her. Because Mohini had developed a survival mechanism. She had developed a coping mechanism that taught her how to survive living in a cage. And so she was unable to give that up. And in spite of the new environment, she couldn't do that. So my question would be, where does that cage exist? Does the physical cage exist? Well, it did initially, but it doesn't anymore. You see, that cage became internalized into Mohini's brain. And to Mohini, she was still in that cage. She could not imagine life beyond it. And that is so much like us as human beings, you see. Mohini identified with her limitations, and that's how we identify ourselves. We are infinite beings, but how do you define an infinite being? How does an infinite being live in this world of bills and cell phones and traffic jams, you say? We live in this world by defining our limitations, by defining who we are and who we aren't. Mohini was unable to change that programming. Mohini was unable to let go of her identification with that animal in a cage. But we do have the ability to make that change. It's not easy, but we can do it, you see. Quote from Marianne Williamson. This is one many of you have heard. Our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us. It's interesting, so many animals, even when they're taken into the jungle and released, will hang around the cage that they've been raised in. They become accustomed to that. We have become accustomed to our limitations, and to let go of our identity and to be unlimited is very difficult. Yet, if we are willing to do it, if we're willing to experience the anxiety, we will eventually experience a very, very powerful shift occurring. We begin to see that the little ego-centered self is no longer in charge of our life. That who we are and what governs our life is something infinitely more powerful and infinitely wiser. A quote from Andrew Cohen, a meditation teacher, writer. He says, evolution isn't just happening. He says, we are a very big part of that process. And when we really get this, the liberation of our power of choice becomes the very essence of our spiritual journey. You will realize that the more awake you become, the more responsible you are for the future, and the more profoundly significant become the choices that you make. Your life becomes the evolutionary principle in action. Ask yourself, whose hands are these? If you are identified with the ego, they are the hands of the ego. But if your purpose has become aligned with the evolutionary impulse, your hands become God's hands. As audacious as this sounds, it's true. When we are aligned with that evolutionary impulse, when we are identified with that evolutionary impulse, rather than identified with our limitations, our hands become God's hands, our feet become God's feet. We become an instrument for the divine. We become an instrument for the next stage of human evolution. We may never know the impact of the choices that we make, but the impact can be very, very powerful. Like the well-known butterfly effect in the chaos theory, just a butterfly flapping its wings in Beijing might be responsible for a thunderstorm in New York City a month later, you see. On December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks refused to relinquish her seat to a white passenger in a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. She acted with courage and personal integrity, yet it is unlikely that she could have imagined the course of events that would be set in motion by her personal actions. The entire civil rights movement began, and from that movement, many, many other liberation movements had begun. We may never know the impact of the choices we make, but we can be certain that when we are willing to let go of our preoccupation with our small self and say yes to this evolutionary impulse, we are profoundly participating in the creation of humanity's future. And I invite you to join with me in that. And I'd like to close with this prayer from the Buddhist tradition. Through the power of my spiritual practice, may all beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May they know the sacred joy that arises in the space beyond suffering. May they rest in equanimity that knows no grasping or hatred. May they experience the oneness of all beings. May my life be of benefit to all. And so it is. Thank you.